Fidel Castro, born August 13, 1926, near Byron, Cuba. Died in November 25, 2016, Cuba, political leader of Cuba, 1959 to 2008, who transformed his country into the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. Castro became a symbol of communist revolution in Latin America. He held the title of premier until 1976 and then began a long tenure as president of the Council of State and the Council of Ministers. He handed over provisional power in July 2006 because of health problems and formally relinquished the presidency in February 2008. Welcome to GeoZone Media. The channel is about histories, mysteries, and news around the world. Castro was born in southeastern Cuba. His father, Fidel Castro y Argaiz, an immigrant from Spain, was a fairly prosperous sugarcane farmer in a locality that had long been dominated by estates of the U.S.-owned United Fruit Company. While married to his first wife, Fidel Castro began an affair with one of his servants, Lina Ruz Gonzalez, whom he later also married. Together they had 7 children. Fidel was one of them, and Raul, who later became his brother's chief associate in Cuban affairs, was another. Fidel Castro attended Roman Catholic boarding schools in Santiago de Cuba and then the Catholic High School Bullen in Havana, where he proved an accomplished athlete. He was named Havana's outstanding schoolboy sportsman in 1943-44, and he excelled in track and field, in the high jump and middle distance running, baseball, basketball, and table tennis. In 1945, he entered the School of Law of the University of Havana, where organized violent gangs sought to advance a mixture of romantic goals, political aims, and personal careers. Castro's main activity at the university was politics, and in 1947 he joined an abortive attempt by Dominican exiles and Cubans to invade the Dominican Republic and overthrow General Rafael Trujillo. He then took part in urban riots that broke out in Bogotá, Colombia, in April 1948. After his graduation in 1950, Castro began to practice law and became a member of the reformist Cuban People's Party, called Ortodoxos. He became their candidate for a seat in the House of Representatives from a Havana district in the elections scheduled for June 1952. In March of that year, however, the former Cuban president, General Fulgencio Batista, overthrew the government of President Carlos Prio Socarrás and canceled the elections. After legal means failed to dislodge Batista's new dictatorship, Castro began to organize a rebel force for the task in 1953. On July 26, 1953, he led about 160 men in a suicidal attack on the Moncada military barracks in Santiago de Cuba in hopes of sparking a popular uprising. Most of the men were killed, and Castro himself was arrested. After a trial in which he conducted an impassioned defense, he was sentenced by the government to 15 years imprisonment. He and his brother Raul were released in a political amnesty in 1955, and they went to Mexico to continue their campaign against the Batista regime. There, Fidel Castro organized Cuban exiles into a revolutionary group called the 26th of July Movement. On December 2, 1956, Castro and an armed expedition of 81 men landed on the eastern coast of Cuba from the yacht Granma. All of them were killed or captured except Fidel and Raul Castro, Ernesto Che Guevara, and 9 others, who retreated into the Sierra Maestra to wage guerrilla warfare against the Batista forces. With the help of growing numbers of revolutionary volunteers throughout the island, Fidel Castro's forces won a string of victories over the Batista government's demoralized and poorly led armed forces. Castro's propaganda efforts proved particularly effective, and as internal political support waned and military defeats multiplied, Batista fled the country on January 1, 1959. Castro's force of 800 guerrillas had defeated the Cuban government's 30,000-man professional army. As the undisputed revolutionary leader, Castro became commander-in-chief of the armed forces in Cuba's new provisional government, which had Manuel Urrutia, a moderate liberal, as its president. In February 1959, Castro became premier and thus head of the government. By the time Urrutia was forced to resign in July 1959, Castro had taken effective political power into his own hands. Castro had come to power with the support of most Cuban city dwellers on the basis of his promises to restore the 1940 Constitution, create an honest administration, reinstate full civil and political liberties, and undertake moderate reforms. But once established as Cuba's leader, he began to pursue more radical policies. Cuba's private commerce and industry were nationalized. sweeping land reforms were instituted, and American businesses and agricultural estates were expropriated. The United States was alienated by these policies and offended by Castro's fiery new anti-American rhetoric. His trade agreement with the Soviet Union in February 1960 further deepened American distrust. In 1960, most economic ties between Cuba and the United States were severed, and the United States broke diplomatic relations with the island country in January 1961. In April of that year, the U.S. government secretly equipped thousands of Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro's government. Their landing at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, however, was crushed by Castro's armed forces. Cuba also began acquiring weapons from the Soviet Union, which soon became the country's chief supporter and trade partner. In 1962, the Soviet Union secretly stationed ballistic missiles in Cuba that could deliver nuclear warheads to American cities, and in the ensuing confrontation with the United States, the world came close to a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended when the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its nuclear weapons from Cuba in exchange for a pledge that the United States would withdraw the nuclear-armed missiles it had stationed in Turkey and no longer seek to overthrow Castro's regime. In the meantime, Castro created a one-party government to exercise dictatorial control over all aspects of Cuba's political, economic, and cultural life. All political dissent and opposition were ruthlessly suppressed. Many members of the Cuban upper and middle classes felt betrayed by these measures and chose to immigrate to the United States. At the same time, Castro vastly expanded the country's social services, extending them to all classes of society on an equal basis. Educational and health services were made available to Cubans free of charge, and every citizen was guaranteed employment. The Cuban economy, however, failed to achieve significant growth or to reduce its dependence on the country's chief export, cane sugar. Economic decision-making power was concentrated in a centralized bureaucracy headed by Castro, who proved to be an inept economic manager. With inefficient industries and a stagnant agriculture, Cuba became increasingly dependent on favorable Soviet trade policies to maintain its modest standard of living in the face of the United States' continuing trade embargo. Castro remained premier until 1976, when a new constitution created a National Assembly and Castro became president of that body state council. He retained the posts of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and Secretary-General of the Communist Party of Cuba, the only legal political party, and he continued to exercise unquestioned and total control over the government. Castro's brother Raul, Minister of the Armed Forces, ranked second to him in all government and party posts. Fidel Castro's early attempts to foment Marxist revolutions elsewhere in Latin America foundered, but Cuban troops played an important role in various conflicts in other less developed countries, especially in Africa. It was long held that Cuban forces were acting as surrogates for the Soviet Union in these Cold War conflicts. However, scholarship that emerged in the early 21st century made clear that Cuba had acted at its own behest in Africa as Castro sought to spread the Cuban Revolution internationally and to bolster his standing among non-aligned countries and in the less developed world. From 1975 to 1989, Cuban expeditionary forces fought in the Angolan Civil War on the side of the Communistic Popular Movement for the liberation of Angola. In 1978, Cuban troops assisted Ethiopia in repelling an invasion by Somalia. By the 1980s, Castro had emerged as one of the leaders of non-aligned countries, despite his ties to the Soviet Union. He continued to signify his willingness to renew diplomatic relations with the United States, provided that it end its trade embargo against Cuba. In 1980, Castro released a flood of immigrants to the United States when he opened the port of Mariel for 5 months. The 125,000 immigrants, including some criminals, strained the capacity of U.S. immigration and resettlement facilities. In the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev began to undertake democratic reforms and Eastern European countries were allowed to slip out of the Soviet orbit, Castro retained a hardline stance, espousing the discipline of communism. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 took him by surprise and meant the end of generous Soviet subsidies to Cuba. Castro countered the resulting economic decline and shortages of consumer goods by allowing some economic liberalization and free market activities while retaining tight controls over the country's political life. In late 1993, Castro's daughter sought asylum in the United States, where she openly criticized her father's rule. The following year, Economic and social unrest led to anti-government demonstrations, the size of which had not been seen in Cuba in some 35 years. Shortly thereafter, Castro lifted restrictions on those wanting to leave the country, and thousands headed for the United States in the largest exodus since the 1980 Mariel Freedom Flotilla. In 1998, Castro allowed Pope John Paul II to visit Cuba for the first time. In 2003, the National Assembly confirmed Castro as president for another 5-year term. During that year, the Cuban government arrested dozens of independent journalists and activists in a renewed government crackdown on dissidents. And some 75 activists were convicted for conspiring with the United States to subvert the revolution. The following year, Castro strengthened his alliance with Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez by helping him bring to fruition the Bolivarian alternative for the Americas, Alternativa Bolivariana para las Americas ALBA. Alternativa later changed to Alianza Alliance, a socialist initiative to promote regional commerce, through which Cuba provided healthcare professionals to Venezuela in exchange for discounted oil. On July 31, 2006, Fidel Castro passed power on a provisional basis to his brother Raúl in order to recover from surgery for a serious intestinal illness. It was the first time since the 1959 revolution that he ceded control. In February 2008, just days before the National Assembly was to vote for the country's leader, Fidel Castro, who had not appeared in public for 19 months, officially declared that he would not accept another term as president. His announcement that he was stepping down was made through a letter that was addressed to the country and posted on the website of the official Communist Party newspaper, Granma. In part it read, "I do not bid you farewell. My only wish is to fight as a soldier of ideas." In the succeeding months, official photos were released of Fidel Castro in private meetings, and in July 2010, he made a public visit to the National Center for Scientific Research in Havana. In September, on the eve of the release of the first volume of his memoirs, The Strategic Victory, he remarked to a reporter from the United States that the Cuban model doesn't even work for us anymore. Many took his comment as an admission of the failure of communism. However, Fidel Castro was quick to qualify his remarks in a speech that followed a few days later. Most analysts saw his remarks as offering support for Raúl's introduction of economic reforms that included a massive layoff of government employees as well as increased toleration of private enterprise. In 2011, Fidel stepped down as Secretary General of the Communist Party of Cuba and was succeeded by Raúl. In March 2016, Fidel, who seldom had been seen in public in recent years, made a high-profile appearance in print when he responded to U.S. President Barack Obama's historic visit to Cuba with a 1,600-word letter in Granma. In the letter, titled Brother Obama, he recapped the aggressive U.S. policy toward Cuba during the Cold War and castigated Obama, the first sitting U.S. president to visit the island in nearly 80 years, for not acknowledging the accomplishments of the Cuban Revolution, including its efforts to eradicate racism. Addressing the warming Cuba-U.S. relations, Castro wrote, "Nobody should be under the illusion that the people of this dignified and selfless country will renounce the glory, the rights, or the spiritual wealth they have gained with the development of education, science, and culture." In April, a frail soon-to-be 90-year-old Castro told the Communist Party Congress that he would be dying soon, and he implored party members to work to fulfill his communist vision for Cuba. Kindly subscribe our GeoZone Media channel for more information. Thank you.